we did have a question from a listener, Kevin, or late last week about the wide receiver room and about how things are shaping up there. We talked about it in the spring, obviously, but since then there's been some changes. Kansas brought in Bryson Canty, who was not on campus during the spring. And so I think the listener was just as curious as maybe we are about the wide receiver room. And luckily for us, it happened to coincide with the fact that we got a chance to talk to some of the receivers and Terrence Samuel, the wide receivers coach, earlier this week. So now we can sort of set the table for this conversation. And yeah, obviously this is the position group that I think wide receiver and linebacker are the position groups that have the two biggest question marks. And I think people will take the term question mark and view it as like a sort of a negative. I don't really mean it that way in this context. I just kind of mean it as I'm just really curious to see what they look like, who's doing what and how they perform at this point. So I'm not trying to alarm anybody by saying, oh, it's a question mark, just more of like a genuinely curious to see what this group has to offer coming up this season. And obviously it's headlined, I think, by Emmanuel Henderson, who has gotten a lot of attention for the speed that he possesses. Matt Gildersleeve made the comment earlier in camp about how he hit the same velocity as Jason Bean. I think for most KU fans, they recognize the speed that Jason Bean possessed. And if you have a player on the outside that possesses a similar level of speed, that is a very tantalizing thought. So maybe just start there. I mean, are you just assuming Emmanuel Henderson is wide receiver one at this point? Is that kind of where you're at? Because I get the sense that's where I think a lot of fans are at. Are you viewing it in the same lens at this point?
I think he has a really good chance to be. I also think, one of the things that we've heard a lot about here recently has been the play of Cam Pickett. And I think that Cam Pickett is kind of going to be in that discussion. One of the things that Samuel talked about is they're cross-training all of those guys. And so if you're sitting here saying, hey, Cam Pickett's your slot, Emmanuel Henderson is going to be, on the outside here, they may move those guys around depending on the formation, and they're training them kind of all over the place. And that presents some really interesting looks, I think, Nick, in that, he said, hey, if you're good at running a post, like, we're going to put you somewhere where you can run a post and run it pretty well. And so I think this is a really interesting receiver group. And I'm glad you phrased the question marks that way, because I do also feel the same way about the linebackers. Because on one hand, it's where you have the most moving pieces is at wide receiver and linebacker. But on the other, it's also where you made the biggest investment, quote unquote, in the transfer portal, right? You brought in guys who have played at other places, who have had success in other places. And so it's not necessarily when we say question mark, oh, this is a position that's not going to play well. We just don't know what that picture is going to look like just yet.
Yeah. The guy that I personally, Kevin, am buying all of the stock on, even more so now, is Levi Wentz.
Yes.
I think Levi Wentz is poised to have a really, really significant role as well in this wide receiver room. And honestly, maybe not even necessarily as like the top receiver, but even more so in terms of blocking. I mean, there was a lot of discussion. We talked about it with him specifically about blocking. The term that Terrence Samuel used to describe Levi Wentz was, he called him a bouncer, like a club bouncer. Like
throwing people out the bar. Yeah,
exactly. Like the guy you send in to throw people out to basically underline his physicality. So I'm buying into all the stock on Levi Wentz at this point. I think he has a chance to play a large role. So I guess maybe if you want to view it from the standpoint of maybe that's your top three guys, is Emmanuel Henderson with outside speed. Cam Pickett is more maybe your slot guy, your yard per catch guy. And then Levi Wentz is sort of that, bullying physical presence as well. Like maybe that's just your sort of your top three receivers at this point. Terrence Samuel also mentioned that Levi Wentz kind of reminded him of what Lawrence Arnold was last year, sort of the same deal, sort of just a big bodied physical presence. Right. And I think every good receiver room wants at least one guy that's like that as well. So again, buying all the Levi Wentz stock at this point.
Yeah, I agree. Samuel had some great quotes. One of the things was, Wentz was the bouncer. Emmanuel Henderson, I think he said something like, when you run 4.3, you move through a room pretty quick, or something like that.
Yeah.
He had some great stuff there. But I think, too, when we talked to Doug Emilian, one of the things that he had talked about was sort of his growing leadership aspect within the receiver room. And I had a chance to ask him just sort of, hey, like, not that you're a bad wide receiver, but you were able to carve out a role in the receiving rotation basically because you were a really nasty blocker. You really, took that to heart and were able to have a lot of success there. And I like that point talking about Levi Wentz too. Is I'm not saying Wentz won't make an impact as a receiver. I think he's not all of that. He can make big plays. He can be physical. He can be a contested catch guy. But to your point, if you're out there, putting guys on their rears as a blocker at wide receiver, you're going to play. And I think that is a great line to playing time for him. A lot of people want to know kind of what's going on with Bryson Canty. He hasn't been out there much. We've had a chance to talk to both Samuel and Lance Leipold about that. And they expect him back in camp, it sounds like. Same with Jaden Nickens, the freshman who came in. Another newcomer, Jaden Doss, came in right before camp. But I think of that group, of the Canty, Nickens, Doss group, if you're saying who's going to play a role this year, I would think it would be Canty. He's a guy, Nick, that I really liked his ceiling coming in. I thought that if he were healthy, I thought that he was going to be one of the 3 starting guys. And so once he gets out there, and reminder, he's a smart kid. He graduated from Columbia in the Ivy League, and Samuel talked about him, taking mental reps even while he's out. He's going to have something to say in that receiving room as well.
Yeah, I think the 2 biggest unknowns are certainly Canty and Doss at this point, I would say. With Canty, he came in the summer, but yeah, sounds like he's been banged up a little bit, dealing with a little bit of injury. But again, something that doesn't sound like it's going to be real long-term, or maybe even will prevent him from being available to start the season. But just simply because of the fact that he joined in the summer and then has been limited now in camp with an injury, has to make you wonder what his impact will be, certainly at least to start the year. Maybe he's a guy that can grow into a role as the season progresses. And then Jaden Doss as well, a guy that I know you're very familiar with, a Kansas City local prospect, went to Nebraska, wasn't really getting the opportunities there, wasn't really quite fitting into the scheme that they had there, decides to enter the transfer portal late in the process in July, commits to Kansas and literally had like 2 conversations, and then comes to Kansas. And then, I mean, he's only been on roster on the team for 3 weeks at this point, if that.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about a guy that literally moved in days before the start of camp. And so just because of that aspect of it, you have to wonder, similarly to Canty, just, with somebody so fresh coming in, what his role can be. But I think Doss is somebody to keep an eye on, Kevin, and I'd love to hear you expand more about this because you've familiar with him, you've watched him for a long time, in that he's the type of player where he maybe doesn't necessarily need to know the whole playbook, quote unquote, but if you can just devise like a couple plays to just get the ball in his hands, right? And then let him maybe do his best work when he does have that ball in his hands.
Yeah, Nick, could he be Torrey Loughlin? Where we've seen him, not really be a top running back, but he had a running back role where he would do certain things. Wasn't one of the top, few wide receivers, but was a guy that went out and had sort of a specific role. And I think he's somebody that can do that really well. We've talked on the show in the past. He's a really good run after catch guy. He's very powerful, can break tackles. And so is he the type of guy that when KU runs that sort of orbit motion offense where you have a wide receiver as the pitchback, is that something that you could have Jaden, maybe get a little bit of work on? As it is, I think they're approaching it right in terms of, he said, hey, we're going to let him, make some mistakes, kind of find his runway a little bit. And I think, to your point, I think he could have a role this year. I think the tantalizing thing for Doss is after this year, you're losing a bunch of those guys. And I think you do get Cam Pickett back. He's a junior. Having Cam Pickett, Jaden Doss, Keaton Kubeka back is sort of a nice little foundational group. Another young guy that I wanted to mention, though, Nick, that we've heard a lot of positive things about is Tate Nagy. And I think that's so fascinating because when you see him out there, if you were to say, hey, one of these wide receivers is a walk-on, you would immediately pick Tate Nagy because of the way that he looks physically. He's not a walk-on. He's on scholarship. He played quarterback in high school. He's also a guy that maybe isn't like the fastest guy in a straight line, but when you watch him move, he does move differently. He's got great agility. He can run routes. He's got great hands. And Nick, one of the things that we saw was them using, I know they don't call it a jugs machine anymore. They've all got technical names or whatever, but that they were shooting basically footballs over the shoulder. And, a lot like if you've ever gone out and hit off of a pitching machine, the pitches don't always come in the same place. Sometimes it's further ahead and you got to accelerate to get there. Sometimes you almost have to slow up, but you have to adjust to it. And watching Tate Nagy do that drill, you could see the vision as both a wide receiver and a reason why, and we're going to talk specialists, why he's been a guy that people have talked about potentially as a punt returner as well, because he was very natural in that drill. He tracked the ball incredibly well, had really soft hands, understood, sort of when to accelerate, when to decelerate, just played the ball really well in the air. And so I hate putting too much on freshmen one way or another, right? If they're really struggling as a freshman, like that's okay. You're supposed to struggle a little bit as a freshman and get better. If you're really good as a freshman, a lot of times guys don't necessarily, continue that upward progress. Maybe they get caught by their teammates. Maybe you bring in other guys in the portal. But I do think everything that you've seen and heard about Tate Nagy at this point has been really, really positive, including the way that he's approaching learning the system and taking notes and all of those little things too.
By the way, if you didn't put two and two together, that is Tate Nagy, son of Chiefs offensive coordinator Matt Nagy, who was actually in Lawrence recently to sort of observe practice as well. So if you didn't, if you hadn't figured that one out quite yet. So yeah, I don't know. He's an interesting piece. I guess I don't have any expectations for him this season. Sure. As you said, he's a smaller guy. Seems like a guy that, to me at least, is somebody who, give him a year or two with Coach Gildersleeve, and then maybe you're talking about a player that could contribute out of the slot.